Hey everyone, it's Jamie and welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to do something a little different here on this channel. I usually talk about art history and do video essays, but today I wanted to take a little detour to do something just kind of for the end of the year and to just kind of get a video out. I wanted to do a top 10 list of the best books I read in 2019, but after looking over all the books I read, I really can only do a top 8. Not that I didn't read a lot of good books, I don't think a lot of them really earned best book kind of title, you know? With that said, I will be honest, the first two I'm going to mention don't really belong on this list, but there's certain reasons I decided I wanted to discuss them anyways, and also I didn't want to do a top 6 best books. The first book I want to talk about is A Boy Worth Knowing by Jennifer Cosgrove. This book follows 17-year-old Nate Shaw, who can talk to ghosts. So Nate has to explore high school, figure out love, and helping everyone in his life with their problems, while also dealing with these very invasive ghosts. The writing is pretty decent, and I would say the story overall is pretty creative. It's a nice little twist, because overall this is, at its core, a love story. So if you don't really like romance, this might not be for you. But if you like romance and are starting to feel like the same stories you're reading are feeling repetitive or aren't very creative anymore, this is a good one to pick up, because let's be honest, the ghosts definitely do add a level of kind of interest that you're not going to get in your typical YA romance novel. Another thing that helped this stand out was that this is a book that does include LGBT representation. The main character, Nate, is gay. However, the reason he's rejected is not because of that, but because he speaks to ghosts. I will say the love story aspect was the most unrealistic part of the story. It just didn't really feel very real, felt very kind of like wish fulfillment in some ways, which is odd because this is like an original story. It's not really fan fiction. I don't know why the entire time I read it, I kind of got the feeling that this is someone's weird wish fulfillment for some reason. It's still an interesting enough read to pick up. I don't think you'll hate it. And let's be honest, who doesn't like ghosts? The next one is I Find You in the Darkness by Alpha. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't usually buy poetry books from Target. And it's because they generally aren't good. However, this is an exception, I will say. I'll say maybe about 1/3, give or take, of the poems really aren't that great. But the rest is pretty amazing. The book of poetry explores grief and the mourning process. And that's mostly the reason why I decided to pick it up. There is an issue where the book is like split into these 3 arbitrary sections called Vesper, Eventide, and Aurora. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm not really I didn't really pick up on what the reasoning was. I did think they were very evocative titles. I think the problem is to write enough poetry that deals with grief, loss, and mourning, you're bound not to really fill a book especially not with a lot of compelling poetry. This comes up to just under 200 pages. I think it's, 187. And yeah, you could tell some of these poems kind of felt like they should have been left out. This is my problem with poetry generally written by one author. That there's always just a lot of the poetry tends to feel very contrived, not very good. I will say, like I said, for the most part, a lot of this poetry was good, and I do like the subject matter, and I thought it was a very interesting approach to talking about mourning and loss in a lot of them, and I did find a lot of them to be very comforting also. With that said, its biggest issues are this really probably shouldn't have been this long, maybe a little shorter, cut out some of the bad poems, as well as the weird 3-section thing didn't really make sense. Number 6 on my list is Get Naked by Stephen T. Siegel, and it is illustrated by 19 artists. This is a graphic novel that's made up of 19 essays, and these essays are all written by Siegel, and they are his experiences and observations towards nudity that he found while traveling the globe. So they're all from different countries, different parts of different countries, all over the world, and how he somehow managed to experience nudity in all of them, and just kind of what he noticed in each different culture and area he was in. What I do love is because there are 19 different artists, the art style from each story is drastically different, and I think that kind of helps give each story its own kind of unique voice. I think also a really reason I did love this is I do love graphic novels, as well as I do love stories that or books that are interested in world culture and exploring different cultures, and this was a very unique way to explore that. Number 5 is technically a reread, and that is Twilight by Stephanie Myers. Now, before you click off the video and think I am like a lunatic or crazy, or a tween girl stuck in this 24-year-old man's body, let me explain. I decided to revisit Twilight because I was thinking a lot about how the novel got a lot of hate and heavy criticism after the 2008 movie adaptation was released. This is not uncommon. I feel like this happens a lot when movies get released. And while I don't think this book is a literary masterpiece, I think Twilight, though, is actually very well written. Twilight explores vampires in a kind of new, but also a very interesting way. They're still kind of monsters if they want to be. And I think this is what's very interesting about Stephanie Meyer's approach. It's very similar to another book I will mention on this list, but also in some ways still very creative in its own right. I found the characters, upon my reread, to be very well written. They literally sound and act like teenagers, and I don't know if this is one of the complaints the book gets a lot. One complaint I do know is a lot of people say they feel like Bella doesn't have a personality. I personally feel like that comes from their interpretation of the script from the movie, because Bella in the book actually is a oddly well-rounded character, something I found surprising upon my reread. She's very sarcastic, she's extremely melodramatic. There's like so many points in this book that I was like, what? Why didn't we get any of these great lines in the movie? There's like a part where I think her and Mike are walking, and she says something along the lines of like it's so rainy there, she just feels like she's gonna die. And I'm like, how dramatic. That is exactly how teenagers talk. I love it. The book, I will say, does fall into some like early 2000 tropes, especially around like the weird like hero saves me from the weird rape fantasy thing, as well as Edward has a lot of those kind of like, I feel like, controlling aspects that were still kind of romanticized in the early 2000s, where it's like controlling but not actually kind of like, I'm gonna watch you and everything you do but let you do what you want. But I overall enjoy this reread. I think reading it now in my 20s actually allowed me to ingest it a lot more. I think my critical thinking skills and my ability to analyze literature is a lot more developed than it was when I read this in like middle school. I'm gonna say it, I don't think Stephanie Meyer gets enough credit as an author, because this is actually a pretty good novel. There was plenty of moments where I was actually stunned by how beautiful her writing can be. I'll say the whole novel isn't extremely beautifully written. It's not prose coming off the page, but there were a few moments, especially when Bella and her friends go to Le Push Beach, And the scenery that she describes, it's so vivid and so beautiful. And then there's also a very interesting word, like, play with color that happens in this book. It's a lot more sophisticated than I think it gets recognized for. Like I said, it's not a literary masterpiece, but I do think it definitely was worth the hype it got in 2005 when it was first published. Now, I have not reread the rest of the series, so I can't speak to their quality. I can tell you from what I remember reading them, I remember hating New Moon, so I'm a little nervous to reread that one. I liked Eclipse enough. I liked the drama, and I liked how the love triangle kind of plays out in that book, because Bella pretty much at that point has made up her mind. She's like, I'm gonna stay with Edward. And then the tension in the love triangle is really just Jacob, and Jacob being kind of aggressive, and it's a really interesting kind of game, I guess, for him. So I'm interested to reread that book, to reinterpret that now with my new critical skills. And then I did not really enjoy the last book, Breaking Dawn. I did not understand why we were in Jacob's head for part of it. And like I said, I'm a little nervous to go back to that one. Number 4 on my list is Bonfire by Kristen Ritter. Ritter, who is more famously known for her role as Jessica Jones on Marvel's Jessica Jones Netflix show, made her debut as an author last year with Bonfire. And as a debut novel, I am thoroughly impressed. The story follows Abby Williams, an environmentalist lawyer, as she returns to her hometown during a lawsuit against the town's main source of income, Optimal Plastics. It's a mystery novel that becomes very entwined with Abby's past and some kind of trauma that happened as she was a kid. The plot, I will say, is probably not the most original, but the writing is phenomenal. Ritter is amazing at creating atmosphere with her writing. Her words can really paint a picture. So like I said, even though a lot of the things that happened in the story didn't feel super original, I was still thoroughly invested because the writing was so beautiful. And like I said, for a debut novel, I'm not expecting someone's first novel to be this super groundbreaking thing, but like I said, still blown out of the water. And I will say, if you love mystery novels with a strong female protagonist, then this is the book for you. And I'm personally very excited to see what other novels she comes out in the future. I will say the character of Abby is very reminiscent of Jessica Jones, and I don't know if that's because she was working on this while working on the show, if she just feels very connected to that character or archetype, but overall, I will say this was a pretty good novel. Even just like, not even just as a debut novel, but as a novel, I did enjoy it, and I definitely think this is one anyone should read, but especially people who love mysteries. Number 3 on my list is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. So I have never seen the 1994 film adaptation, but vaguely know of it.
And you're sure this isn't just some fanboy thing? Because I fought more than a couple pimply, overweight vamps that called themselves Lestat.
But I'm gonna be honest, I'm very happy I read this novel. I love the style in which it's written in, and I think the characters just feel so real. I don't think I've read a book before where the characters kind of felt so... there was something about the way Anne Rice wrote each character. It felt like not only that I knew them, because I kind of feel like I know all the characters in the books I read this year, but there's something where I was like, I could believe that Lestat or Louis existed. Or is it Louis? I'm going to call him Louis, but it might be pronounced Louis, because he is from like the South, in the New Orleans area, so lots of French, but I'm going to say Louis. Lestat and Louis, and then just every character, even like some of the smaller characters, I just felt like I could believe they're real. And it was the way she described them and the way the narrative worked around them. It just felt like this is something I think not just people who love vampires should read, but anyone who loves developing characters. I know in an interview, Anne Rice said that she felt like she knew Lestat the most, that she felt like she knew anything that she could about him. She had a line in an interview where she said if she went to like an opera or a movie, she would know if Lestat liked it or not. And I was like, it feels like that because this is marvelous. Something that not a lot of people talk about that I was thinking about reading it is this novel as an introspective piece that's exploring grief in the mourning process is very interesting. It's kind of, I think, a little bit more subtext. I was picking up on it, and then I had read some interviews of her talking about how this book was inspired by the death of her child. I believe it was a daughter. And it just kind of like clicked for me. I was like, oh my god, this book, and no wonder why I'm picking up on these themes and aspects around loss and the grieving process. It's almost as every chapter goes on, there's something else to mourn, to move on from. There's so much like mourning something, not just death, but also like the ending of a relationship or a friendship or of whatever. I mean, there is lots of death in this book too. There's also 12 other books in this series known as the Vampire Chronicles. If you're interested in getting lost in this world, I'm probably not going to pick up all 12. That's a lot, especially where I'm pretty happy with how this book ended. But who knows, I might change my mind. Second place on my list is From Here to Eternity. Traveling the World to Find the Good Death by Caitlin Doughty. You might know Caitlin from her YouTube channel, Ask a Mortician. On this channel, she removes the barrier and allows the public to look in on the death industry and become aware of what your rights are when you're planning a funeral or just about death in general. Her second book, From Here to Eternity, is a collection of her travels. Doughty has explored the world in search for one thing, and that is to experience as many funeral and death rituals as possible. She has written them all down in this very thought-provoking, extremely well-written, and at times humorous, non-fiction companion. From Dia de Muertos festivals in Mexico to Japanese cremation traditions, Doughty presents all of these in order to kind of bring up a real issue that she has noticed here in the United States from working in the death industry. Doughty argues that we've become so divorced from death and death rituals due to the rise of the funeral industry that it has negatively impacted our ability to mourn and grieve, essentially by creating this industry that sweeps the dead away from us and creates these picture-perfect funerals and wakes for us. We are no longer able to confront death. Therefore, we are no longer really able to mourn properly. And part of the mourning process is not so much for the deceased, but for the living to be able to process what death means. And I honestly agree with her. This novel highlights how vastly the United States has fallen behind in all these other ways. Here in the United States, we used to have a very rich history with death. She talks a little bit about that in this book, as well as on her YouTube channel. This was my number one book for most of the year. I read this back in April. The book is extremely insightful and thoughtful. Like I said, there's a lot of good humor in it. And by good humor, I mean it feels appropriate, doesn't feel disrespectful. She has a thing for comedy. And I honestly would recommend this book to just about anyone. I don't see there's any reason why you shouldn't read this book. And if reading is not really your cup of tea, I don't know why you're watching this video, but if you don't want to read it, you can always check out her YouTube channel where she has amazing content there as well. Number one on my list is Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. Not only has this become my most recent read, but it's also my favorite. my most favorite of 2019. It is a truly beautiful story that follows Saeed and Nadia as they flee from their own country and become refugees migrating from city to city. The story not only chronicles as they fall in and out of love, but it also chronicles how their lives change as they continue to migrate, for better or worse. Extremely thought-provoking and heart-wrenching is really the only way I can explore this book. There's not a lot of humor in it. It's a very heavy, dense read in content-wise. Length-wise, it's about 230 pages. I read it all in, or most of it in a day. I'd read a chapter or two at work, and then I went away for a weekend and pretty much read this all down in one sitting. Could not put it down. It's so interesting the way it kind of weaves in different elements and talks about the issues around immigration and refugees in such a nuanced way. It brings up the issues for the immigrants, but it also brings up for the issues that affect the people who live in the countries that these immigrants are coming to. So it's very nuanced, it's very beautiful. One of the best parts in this book for me was when they end up in London at one point, and Saeed is like, why don't the British want us here? Like, why don't they like us? And Nadia is pretty much like, I get it. She's like, even though we have nowhere to go, we are still the outsiders. We're coming in, we're taking up space. Like, she's like, I get it. It's not right, but I get it. And I'm like, that's a very nuanced way to look at it, and I think also it really appeals to maybe people who are on that side of the spectrum where they're afraid, they don't want immigrants. I think it kind of shows to you, hey, look, we get it, you're human, but these are human beings who need to go somewhere. Overall, it's one of the best books. Heart-wrenching, and honestly, I never thought Hamid would be able to outdo himself. In 2007, he released The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which I thought was his best book, one of my favorite books of all time. Once again, dealing with a lot of issues around immigration and what it means to be an immigrant. But this one just took the cake. I was so blown away. Like I said, I couldn't put it down once I started it, really. And not only am I going to say Exit West is my favorite book of 2019, I'm going to say it's one of my favorite novels of, all time. Anyways, let me know down below if you've read any of these. Let me know if any of these interest you, as well as let me know what your top whatever number list is for 2019. I'm hoping to read more books in 2020, as well as I'm working on 3 videos right now. 2 of them are analytical movie reviews, where I'm trying to actually deeply analyze 2 movies, 2 different videos, and then as well as a longer video that actually relates to a lot of the work Caitlin Doughty does. So hopefully those will come out soon. Who knows? It takes me forever to make content on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next year.